Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay, and today I'm doing a solo episode based around a question. That question is, what makes some people excellent at their craft and others average? So when we think of excellence, people who are really, really good at what they do, we might be tempted to think about extreme talent or extreme effort or otherwise extreme behavior. I think of Rocky Balboa, somebody like the person who wakes up at 4 a.m. every morning for a run and then chugs down 12 raw eggs before heading to the first of 3 practices. They're just willing to do and able to do things that the average person isn't or can't. But maybe it's not so extreme. So maybe what makes some people excellent at their craft is not as extreme as we might expect. So to answer that question, I want to talk today about a paper called The Mundanity of Excellence. And this is a paper about what makes some people really elite at what they do. And this is a 1989 sociological study into the nature of excellence, using Olympic swimmers as a case study. Swimming is one of those sports that, like running, has few variables between races and quantitative metrics of success. So I'm not just thinking about excellence in terms of sport. There's a lot of different crafts or things that you can be excellent at. But swimming was a good choice for this study because, the size of an Olympics pool is set, the length of the races is set. There's very little variability between races, and so you can really see who is better than other people. So the study is by Professor Daniel Chambliss, and it was set out in the mid 1980s. And the goal was to understand stratification. So again, who was better than others? And I'm interested in this question, one, because, there's some things that I like to do. There's some crafts that I have myself. As people who listen know, I'm very interested in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, picking up an instrument, but also because Stoicism looks at living well as a craft. That's a metaphor we talk about a lot on this podcast. Living well, it's not, some people aren't born better than others. It's a skill. It's something you practice. You develop your courage. You develop your kindness. You develop your ability to handle situations without getting angry, like any other skill. So if you want to practice philosophy as a way of life, you should be very interested in how other people achieve excellence in other domains. So today I wanted to go over the key lessons from this paper. So lesson number 1, excellence requires qualitative differentiation. To quote the paper, doing more does not equal doing better. So the first argument the paper makes is that high performance focuses on qualitative, not quantitative differences. You don't become a great swimmer by swimming more. You become a great swimmer by how you swim. So successful people are different in terms of technique. They have better technique. They're different in terms of discipline. They're more likely to be consistent and to not deviate from rules. And they're different in terms of attitude. So there's actually an inversion of attitude that was observed where less successful people would find competitions nerve-wracking. They would find them stressful. They would find hard practices discouraging. And then there's this difference that happens in elite athletes where they actually find the challenges invigorating. They find the difficult practices give them motivation or energy as a meaningful part of their life. So in other words, what matters most is not the what, it's the how. The study found that competitive children, so you think of people who are winning local meets or competing regularly, they're often not training any less than Olympic medalists. But what changes from, okay, you're a successful 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, competing locally, competing with your high school, what changes from that and an Olympic gold medalist is how you practice. Actually, what takes place in the practice, the way that the technique is focused upon, the intensity of your swimming. So if we think of the what as the amount of hours you spend in the pool, and you think of the how of what you're doing with those hours or how you're approaching those hours or how you're thinking about your time in the pool, sure, there's people, that don't swim, and you're going to see a huge difference if you go from 0 hours a week to 10 hours a week. Yeah, there's probably going to be quite a significant difference. But it's not like it increases linearly. It's not like you add more hours in the pool and you continue to get better. At a certain point, you peak out in terms of raw hours, and what matters is how you're approaching that time. And that's that qualitative differentiation, not the quantitative differentiation. Again, focused on technique, discipline, and attitude. I thought this was really insightful because we often get so focused on copying what other people do, but not thinking about really deeply or carefully on how they're doing it or the way that they're approaching what they do and the mindset that they take into that work or that study or that practice. So in Stoicism, if I made an analogy to Stoicism, it would be something like, you don't become better by reading more books. I don't just become a better Stoic by reading Marcus Aurelius for the third or fourth time, by reading more and more obscure academic work or specialized work. It's how you engage with the books. It's the qualitative experience of how you approach your study of philosophy. So good technique, which probably means taking the arguments seriously, being a disciplined thinker, consistency, and then a joy in the mundane aspects of it. That's that attitude part. You appreciating that daily aspect to the practice. One quote from the paper I really liked was that there are really several worlds, each with its own pattern of conduct. And what Dr. Chambliss is speaking about here is that if you looked at the training routines of intermediate, advanced, or Olympic level swimmers, again, on paper, the amount of hours they were doing were very similar. The routines are very similar, but the world is different in terms of the way they approach practice, maybe the way their coach speaks to them, the amount of focus they put onto certain techniques. There's, again, that qualitative difference, not that quantitative differences. And those can be hard to measure or observe from the outside. But the levels in swimming or any craft are best understood as separate worlds, each with their own norms, cultural practices, and qualitative features. That's what this study uncovered. So that's lesson number 1. Excellence requires qualitative differentiation. Lesson number 2 is that talent does not lead to excellence. So Dr. Chambliss makes the argument that it's an argument against the importance of talent. He argues that it's actually harmful for explaining excellence. And there's 3 points he makes here. First, other factors better correlate to success. So if you look at swimmers being from a certain part of the US, Southern California, where it's sunny all day, people have access to pools, there's a big swimming culture, that's much more likely to lead to swimming excellence. That has a much stronger correlation to if you're going to become an Olympic champion than any sort of measurement of talent. So really your circumstances or your explain your success a lot more. And the point here is not so much that talent doesn't exist. It's that when we point to somebody and we say, that person was excellent because they were talented, it's not really a good way of talking about things. That person was excellent just as much as because of the fact that they were born in Southern California, that they happened to go to a school with a strong swimming program, or that they had supportive parents that took them to practice. It's really that when we speak of excellence in terms of talent, we can make it feel like it's something outside of our control or something almost divine. This person is gifted. This person has something that I could never have. And really, there's a lot of things that we can influence that are in our control that we can point to, that if we were trying to make a good swimmer, we would want to control for these things even more than we would want to control for talent, because you can't really control for talent in the same kind of way. The second argument that he makes is that talent is indistinguishable from its effects. So the argument here is that talent's a lagging indicator. We use it to explain things we don't understand. So we call successful people talented. And when someone we didn't say was talented starts to win, we don't say, oh, they're untalented but winning. We say, oh, we didn't recognize their talent, or we didn't understand their talent. And the point here is that talent becomes a kind of explanatory catch-all. I don't really understand how excellence works, so I'm going to point to talent as a cop-out. And I think the point here is really helpful, is that we should try to understand the underlying causes of excellence. We should try to understand the behaviors, cultures, supporting circumstances that lead to excellence. We shouldn't just point to talent. And if talent was this thing we could accurately describe and point to, the paper argues, we would have these untalented, successful people, but we very rarely are able to describe that accurately, because we almost just assume everybody that's successful is talented. We don't point to anybody that's winning the Olympics in swimming and say how untalented they are. The third argument the paper makes is that the basic level of talent, the floor, required for success is actually quite low. So here, Dr. Chambliss argues that there is some fact around some sort of level of innate ability. We can't get around that argument. Some people are born better at swimming than others. Some people are going to be born very not disposed to be good swimmers. Some people have a very low capability to be excellent athletes. We don't want to ignore this fact when we're talking about excellence and we're talking about talent. But his argument is that there's kind of a low floor for this. There's a certain amount of ability you need, a certain amount of talent you need, and then what explains success above that floor are then these things that are up to you, your way of approaching the work, those kind of qualitative differences, and then the amount of effort you put into the circumstance. He doesn't make a particularly strong argument for this. I don't know if there's any sort of way of quantifying where that floor might be. But the point is that if we are to think of talent at all, we should think of it as a minimum, not a maximum. This person is not the best person in the world because of their talent, the best person in the world because of their choices and their approach to practice and their supporting circumstances. However, all of the elite people have a certain floor. And then the other argument is that floor is probably much lower than we expect it to be. And here he also argues, which I think is valuable, is that we have emotional reasons to be invested in this idea of talent. It can be very good for our egos because it's a cop-out. We can say, well, I lost because that person was more talented than me, or if I was as talented as them, I would have achieved the same success as they did. But he says we do that to protect our ego, not because it reflects reality. And I think that's worth thinking about. We can often tell stories about ourselves to protect our ego, but we can tell stories about other people as well. We can say they can do things that I can't, and then I'm not responsible for my lack of success or my lack of excellence because I wasn't born as talented as they were. And I think one of the things I take away from this paper is that we should be very careful to interrogate thoughts like that. So that was the second lesson, that talent does not lead to excellence. 3 arguments for that I hit on was that other factors better correlate to success. Talent is indistinguishable from its effects. It's a thing we use to explain stuff we don't understand. And that the basic level of talent that is required for success is actually quite low. It's better to think of talent as a floor rather than a ceiling. And with that, I'll go on to the third lesson. And this is that excellence is mundane. So the third part of the paper argues that excellence is achieved by doing the boring stuff well. So here he gives the example of Mary Meagher, who's a 3-time Olympic champion in swimming. And there was an interview with Mary. It was like, how did you become so great? What did you do that's special, that's different? And Mary describes one day at 13 deciding to always show up to practice on time and to always do her turns in practice perfectly. Those were the only 2 changes she decided to make. And then the next Olympics, she won gold. And even though there's two ways to think about that story. One way to think is, wow, what an incredibly talented person. Mary must be so talented to have achieved gold just by showing up to practice on time and by doing her turns perfectly. That would be the very talent heavy explanation of excellence. And what the paper argues is that no, that's actually that qualitative difference that they were pointing to earlier. Decided to not just show up and do what her coach told her to do. She said, I'm going to take the time I spend very seriously. I'm never going to miss another minute of practice. I'm always going to be on time, ready to get in the pool. And that's a kind of attitude shift. And the second point is that I'm going to take my technique very, very seriously. At least one technique, doing the turns. I'm going to put all of my intention and effort into every single rep of this so that it's perfect. And this is just one anecdote. It's an example of an interview with one Olympic champion. Other Olympic champions would have different stories or lessons to share. But the point of the article is that, one, that's that kind of qualitative difference he was speaking on, and two, that's actually a very mundane change. She didn't decide to wake up at 3 a.m. and get a run in before everybody else and then travel across the world to some special remote training program in some different country. She just said, I'm going to do my turns perfectly and I'm never going to be late to practice. And so the what is very mundane, I suppose. The what is very boring. But the how is where that excellence is, that kind of, that qualitative difference, that difference in mindset. Another example the paper talks about is Olympic champion swimmer Rowdy Gaines, who decided to master the start of the race, the jump off the block, by studying hours of tape. He just said, this is the thing. If I can do one thing great, I'm going to be the best person off the whistle. I'm going to have the best dive. I'm going to have the best jump off the block, and I'm going to invest my time there. And the point is that that's not a very cool, interesting change. It's a mundane change, but it's a mundane change with an exceptional mindset, focus, attention, that qualitative difference again. So that's one way in which excellence is mundane. Again, these very boring, unfancy shifts in perspective that lead to this Olympic level excellence. These are both Olympic champions. The second way in which excellence is mundane is that long-term motivation is very mundane. So doing the same thing every day with the same amount of focus for 3 years leading up to the Olympics, it's not cool, it's not sexy, it's not interesting. It's very, very boring. Eating the same meal, getting the same amount of the right amount of sleep. Again, showing up to practice every day on time, bringing that intensity to every turn you do or every jump off the block. These are not exciting or fancy things. They're not done because of a burning passion or some sort of inspiration. Excellence comes from a willingness to repeat the same boring tasks the same way, day after day. The third way in which excellence is mundane is that being excellent, the paper argues, and I thought this was a really, really interesting point. Being excellent is actually just doing the boring stuff well when the pressure is on. So when you've trained, you're a swimmer and you spent 3 years doing the same 50-meter race, you've practiced your jump off the block so many times, you've practiced your turn so many times. Being excellent in the race is not jumping to some sort of level of inspiration that you've never achieved before. It's just doing what they know they can do in practice, what is now mundane to them. They've done 10,000 times, just repeating that kind of performance. I think also when the actor goes on stage, they're not trying to do something incredible. They're just trying to say the lines they've already memorized. It's doing the boring thing when the pressure's on. The commencement speaker who can't say their speech in front of thousands, even though it's just reading words on a page. They've read before, but it's doing that under the pressure of the moment. I think of this example from Chael Sonnen. He's a MMA fighter, fought in the UFC. And when he was coaching MMA fighters, there's a video of him talking about, I'm sure he took this from somewhere else, but he talks about this example where If you had a piece of wood on the ground, like a 2x4, and I were to ask you to walk along the 2x4, could you do it? And everybody could do it. I could do it. Everybody listening could do it. It's a very easy task. It's just walking a straight line. And now if I suspended that 2x4 in the air, in between two buildings or between two towers, and now asked you to walk along it from one to another, could you do it? And I think that's a really good example of excellence. It's just doing something that is boring or mundane under high pressure. And that is, to me, such a good example of that. Another argument Dr. Chambliss makes is that we can actually ruin our chance at excellence by refusing to accept that it is mundane, that it is boring. So he gives an example of a PhD student that he worked with, he came in as a junior graduate student. He was a first-year PhD student. This person was a very successful older PhD student who worked constant 12-hour days, was incredibly well-respected by the faculty. And so he was close to, this excellent PhD student was close to graduating when Dr. Chambliss started. And 7 years later, when Chambliss graduated, this incredibly talented PhD student was still working away 12 hours a day. And Chambliss's argument from this anecdote is that this talented person could not accept the fact that you just had to turn in the PhD dissertation at some point. His pursuit of perfection limited his excellence because he could not accept that at some point he just had to do boring, average, non-dramatic work to move forward. Now, I'm not necessarily sure what to take of this anecdote. I think you could argue that working 12-hour days is doing the boring, consistent work that most people struggle to do. It's difficult to say because I didn't know the person and they only write a paragraph or two about them as an example. But the takeaway for me from this point is that if you are not willing to do boring stuff, if you think your pursuit of excellence needs to be dramatic and exciting, you will limit your ceiling. You will impede your capacity to excel. You have to take enjoyment in the boring aspects. You have to be willing to do those boring aspects day in and day out for a really long period of time. Again, between Olympic cycles is 4 years, so it's locking in for this 4-year period. And if you are willing to do the intense, the dramatic aspects, but you're not willing to do the boring aspects, the submitting of the PhD dissertation, even if it's not as good as you want it to be, or the showing up to practice every time or eating the right way consistently, well, then you're not going to be excellent. So if you refuse to accept the mundanity of excellence, it limits your capacity to actually be great. In summary, the mundanity of excellence I thought was a great paper, raised some really interesting points about the nature of excellence, questioned some of our intuitions around talent, around the virtuosity of being great, and around, people that are really good at things they're just different, or they're just doing things that we're not doing. And they challenged some of those assumptions. So again, we covered 3 main lessons about the nature of excellence. First is that excellence requires qualitative differentiation. The difference between good people and great people is not what they do, it's how they do it. It's the focus on technique, discipline, and attitude. Again, we think of that example of Mary Meagher, who decided, I'm going to show up to practice on time, and I'm going to really get my every turn exactly right. That's a qualitative differentiation. Everybody else that is a competitive swimmer is putting in hours a week of work. But what differentiated Mary, the argument here, is that how she's approaching those hours, the mindset or the cultural norms she's bringing into those practices. So that was lesson 1. Lesson 2, talent does not lead to excellence. Maybe that claim is a bit strong, but I would soften that to be that talent is can be a very dangerous way to explain excellence. So we want to be very careful about our ideas of talent. We talked about how other factors better correlate to success. We talked about how talent is indistinguishable from its effects. It's just a thing we apply to or say about people who are good at something. And that if talent does exist, it's better to think of it as a floor rather than a ceiling. And we think about it as a ceiling to protect our egos, to not have to feel bad about the fact that we're not as good as other people. The third lesson from the paper is that excellence is mundane. And what is meant by that is that excellence is achieved by doing the boring stuff well. It's achieved by doing that boring stuff well over a long period of time, which is actually a very kind of boring life. The competition is big and dramatic. The Olympics, wow, it's this huge thing. But the actual effort is just this ability to lock into a rather kind of mundane existence consistently. And that even when we come down to the Olympics, success in the moment comes down to then repeating that mundane thing you've done 10,000 times in the high pressure situation. For me personally, I really enjoyed the paper. My biggest takeaways are first, always looking for qualitative differentiation. So not thinking about what successful people do, but how they do it, the focus, the intentionality, the intensity. I think that is a really important idea for me, because when you get to a certain level of success, your day is already filled up. You're already disciplined. Whether that's in work or in sport, I've reached those levels in both those spaces where you start to run out of hours. And so I think what really makes the difference is the way you approach those hours. And not just what you're doing in those hours, but the kind of the attention to detail, which parts of your day you're saying matter most, that kind of differentiation. So that's something that I'm taking away from the article. The second thing I like is that idea of maintaining the mundane, looking at moments of performance as being able to do what we always do or normally do well. So if we think about that in a Stoicism example, Epictetus says the key to a good life is making good use of impressions. What that means is seeing situations as they are, not as our first impression of them is. Understanding when we have a false impression and not allowing ourselves to get caught up in that false impression. And that's a very boring thing, or it's a very mundane thing, in that we're doing it all the time, always. So I'm doing that when I'm going to the grocery store. I'm doing that when I'm driving. I'm doing that when I'm making plans with friends, when I'm spending time with my friends. And so Stoic excellence of character is just, can I keep that up? Can I maintain the ability to do that well, even when the situation is extreme, when it's tempting to get angry, when it's tempting to feel betrayed, or to be anxious or nervous? Can I maintain that clarity of thought that I have when I'm going to the grocery store? And in that way, character is not about having some sort of superhuman capacity. It's about maintaining your boring normal capacity through turbulent times. And I think there's something really inspiring about that. I think it's both true, but also motivating, because it's that point about we raise this idea of talent to protect our egos. That's another point from the paper. We can think about kind of moral excellence. Some people they're just great people. He's just a great person. That can kind of just be an out. Instead, you have the capacity to be a great person. And you also have the capacity to be a bad person. All of those things are accessible to you. You don't have, it's not explainable by talent. It's just about the choices that you make and your capacity to think well. Just kind of a boring thing. It's a normal thing, but your capacity to do it even in extreme situations. So that's the paper, Mundanity of Excellence. It's not too long and it's written accessibly. I'd recommend it if you thought this podcast was interesting. And I don't think you need to be an Olympic champion athlete. I don't think the Stoics think that. But because living well is a craft, we should always pay attention to people that are really good at what they do and see what lessons we can learn and apply to our own lives. And so this paper was a discussion of some of those lessons. I hope you enjoyed it.